Chapter 1. The Forbidden Planet of Drenar. The vastness of the galaxy stretched out beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor sat, shrouded in an eerie silence. Drenar had become a name of infamy, spoken only in whispers among the Galactic Empire's elite, for it was the final resting place of the galaxy's most formidable warriors. The planet was known to be a death sentence, an unforgiving wasteland filled with dangers unimaginable. It was a planet where not a single soul had returned, save for one unbelievable signal that had reached the Empire's most secure communication channels. Drenar. Its very name evoked fear. The throne room was grand, gleaming with gold and obsidian columns that stretched towards the sky, but none of its opulence could mask the tension that now thickened the air. Standing in the center of the room were the Emperor's most trusted generals, eyes filled with both confusion and disbelief. Every so often, their gazes flickered toward the holographic projection in the center, where the origin of the transmission blinked. "How is this possible?" one of the Emperor's advisors finally muttered, his voice low and uncertain. "A signal? From Drenar? This can't be right. Not after all we've lost." The Emperor's eyes narrowed, and he steepled his fingers, leaning forward from his throne. He was not a man to believe in the impossible, and yet, here it was, a distress signal, originating from Drenar, of all places. And it wasn't just any distress signal, it was human. "Silence!" the Emperor's voice boomed, causing every figure in the room to snap to attention. His cold, piercing gaze fell upon the closest general. "Explain this. Now." General Catter, a veteran warrior with scars lining his hardened face, cleared his throat and stepped forward. His normally calm and authoritative demeanor faltered for a moment, the weight of the situation evident. "Your Excellency, we have analyzed the signal multiple times. There is no error. The transmission originates from Drenar, and it appears to be a distress beacon from a human survivor." A ripple of shock moved through the room. The Emperor's icy stare remained fixed on Catter, who swallowed hard before continuing. 2 years ago, the human was part of an exploratory mission. It seems their ship crash-landed on the planet. According to the transmission, this survivor has been living on Drenar since then alone. The Emperor's expression remained unreadable. "And our own warriors? The best of the Empire? What of them?" His voice was dangerously calm. Catter hesitated, then spoke quietly. "None of them returned." The Emperor rose slowly, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the room. His gaze flicked to the projection of Drenar, where a small, blinking dot represented the source of the transmission. How could it be? The Empire had sent its greatest fighters to that cursed world, and yet they had all fallen. But a human, one of the weaker species of the galaxy, had survived? He turned, his cape billowing behind him as he strode toward the exit. "Prepare the fleet. We will investigate this anomaly personally." Within hours, the fleet had been assembled, a mass of warships and scouts that filled the stars as they made their way toward the Forbidden Planet. The Emperor's flagship, a colossal vessel bristling with weapons and reinforced with the strongest metals in the galaxy, led the charge. In the Emperor's private quarters, Catter stood before a holographic map, detailing the surface of Drenar. The Emperor entered, his gaze never leaving the map. "Tell me, General, what do we know of Drenar's surface?" Catter tapped a few keys, zooming in on the planet's jagged landscapes, where violent storms raged and mountains of obsidian stretched into the sky. "It's hell, Your Excellency. The atmosphere is toxic, the gravity is twice what most species are used to, and the wildlife is unpredictable, to say the least. The storms alone would kill most beings within hours. But it's not just the weather. The planet seems alive, shifting constantly. The ground moves as if it has a will of its own." The Emperor stared at the map, unblinking. "And yet, a human survived." Catter nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "So it seems. If the transmission is to be believed, they've managed to survive for 2 years. Alone." The Emperor's expression hardened. "When we land, I will see this human for myself. Prepare the landing party. We go to Drenar at once." The descent onto Drenar was harrowing. As the Emperor's ship pierced through the planet's thick atmosphere, violent storms battered its shields, and the hull groaned under the immense pressure. The view from the ship's observation deck revealed a world of utter chaos, a landscape of jagged cliffs, rivers of molten rock, and lightning that struck the ground with terrifying precision. The air was thick with toxins, creating a permanent haze that obscured the horizon. The Emperor stood at the front of the deck, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out over the hellish landscape. Even with all his experience, all the worlds he had conquered, Drenar was something different. It was a world of chaos, seemingly designed to resist any form of life. And yet, somewhere out there, a single human had managed to endure. As the ship finally touched down, a group of elite soldiers surrounded the Emperor, ready for anything. They wore reinforced armor, designed to withstand the planet's extreme conditions, and carried weapons powerful enough to vaporize most creatures in an instant. The Emperor himself donned a suit of regal yet functional armor, its intricate design masking the advanced technology within. The landing ramp extended, and the Emperor stepped onto the surface of Drenar. The gravity was immediately oppressive, pressing down on him like a heavy weight, but he moved forward with unyielding determination. His guards followed closely, their weapons raised as they scanned the environment for any threats. And then, from the swirling dust and storm, a figure emerged. It was human, tall and gaunt, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing that barely held together. The figure walked toward them with a slow, measured gait, a makeshift spear in hand. For a moment, the Emperor's guards tensed, ready to attack, but the Emperor raised a hand to stop them. The figure came closer, and the Emperor could finally see the man's face. It was worn and scarred, with a thick beard that had grown wild over the years. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert eyes that had seen too much but had survived. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, his voice rough from years of breathing the planet's toxic air. "Didn't think I'd ever see another soul out here." The Emperor stepped forward, his cold gaze fixed on the human. "You're the one who sent the signal?" The man nodded, lowering his spear. "Name's Jack Rains. Used to be a captain before. Well, before all this." The Emperor studied him closely, his mind racing with questions. How had this human survived where his greatest warriors had failed? What was it about Drenar that had allowed him to endure? "You've been here for 2 years?" the Emperor asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jack shrugged. "More or less. Time gets a bit fuzzy out here." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "And how is it that you've survived?" Jack smiled, a weary, knowing smile. "Drakennar's a hell of a place, but you don't survive it by fighting. You survive it by learning how not to die." Chapter 2. The Truth About Drenar. The Emperor and his elite forces had gathered in the temporary camp they had set up near the landing zone. The air was thick with tension, both from the oppressive gravity of Drenar and the weight of the questions hanging in the air. Jack Rains, the human who had somehow defied the odds and survived 2 years on this death world, sat at the center of their circle, a fire crackling before him, rare luxury on a planet like this. Jack's face was etched with the lines of a man who had seen too much, his eyes flickering with a mixture of wariness and dark humor. He poked at the fire absent-mindedly with a stick, knowing full well that the Emperor and his soldiers were waiting for answers. But he wasn't in a rush to give them. He had learned the hard way that Drakennar's secrets weren't to be shared lightly. The Emperor watched him closely, his regal armor gleaming in the firelight, his face a mask of cold calculation. "You've survived here for 2 years, human," he said, his voice commanding. "Explain how that's possible. My finest warriors, men who have fought in the most dangerous corners of the galaxy, died here within days. Yet you remain." Jack shrugged, his rough voice cutting through the tense silence. "I've been asking myself that same question for a while now, Emperor. The short version? I got lucky. The long version? Well, it's not just luck." The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Jack took a deep breath and leaned back, glancing at the jagged cliffs and swirling storms that surrounded them. Drenar is not like any other place in the galaxy. It's not just the wildlife or the storms or the violent terrain. Those things are bad enough on their own, but there's something deeper at play here. This planet isn't just dangerous, it's alive. The Emperor's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of interest in his otherwise stoic gaze. Around him, his soldiers exchanged wary glances. The very notion that a planet could be alive was absurd, but Jack spoke with a grim certainty that was hard to dismiss. Jack continued, his voice low and steady. "At first, I thought it was just paranoia. I mean, after the crash, I was barely holding it together. Most of my crew died on impact, the few who didn't. Well, Drenar took care of them real quick. I watched them get ripped apart by things I still can't describe. But it wasn't just the creatures. The planet itself moves, changes. Sometimes entire landscapes shift overnight, like it's reshaping itself. And the storms, they don't follow any pattern I've ever seen. The Emperor folded his arms, leaning slightly forward. You're suggesting that Drakenar is sentient? That it's aware of those who land on its surface? Jack shrugged. I don't know if I'd call it sentient, but it sure as hell reacts to us. Every time I tried to set up a permanent shelter, the storms would tear it down. Every time I thought I found a safe route, the terrain would shift, and I'd be back where I started. The creatures here, they're part of it. They don't act like predators, they act like soldiers. They move in coordinated patterns, like they're being directed by something. The Emperor remained silent, considering Jack's words. He had heard of planets with hostile ecosystems, places where life seemed designed to kill, but never a planet that actively fought back, that adapted to the presence of outsiders. If what Jack said was true, then Drakenar was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And yet you survived, the Emperor said, his voice a measured monotone. How? Jack smiled grimly. Like I said, it wasn't just luck. I figured out pretty quickly that fighting wasn't going to get me anywhere. I had to learn how to live with the planet. You can't beat Drakenar, but you can outsmart it sometimes. I started to notice patterns. The storms, the creatures, even the shifting terrain. It all seemed to be connected. Like Drakenar was testing me, seeing how far I could go. He paused, glancing at the soldiers standing around the Emperor. Their eyes were filled with skepticism, but Jack didn't care. They hadn't lived through what he had. They hadn't seen what he'd seen. The creatures here, they're not natural, Jack continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I don't know if they were created by the planet, or if they've just evolved to survive here, but they're nothing like the predators you find on other worlds. They're intelligent, coordinated. They hunt in packs, set traps, and they seem to know exactly when you're most vulnerable. I watched one of my crew, one of the best soldiers I've ever known, get lured into a canyon by what looked like an easy target. The next thing I knew, the ground opened up beneath him, and he was gone. The Emperor's expression darkened. And you believe the planet controls these creatures? Directs them? Jack nodded. Yeah, it's the only thing that makes sense. I've seen the way they move, the way they react to my presence. It's like they're being commanded. The planet knows I'm here, and it's been trying to kill me ever since I landed. The only reason I've survived this long is because I've learned to move when the planet isn't looking. One of the Emperor's advisors, a wiry man with sharp features and an air of superiority, snorted in disbelief. You expect us to believe that a planet, a lump of rock and dirt, is deliberately trying to kill you? That it's somehow alive? Jack met the man's gaze with a cold, hard stare. Believe what you want, but I'm still here, aren't I? The advisor's smirk faded under Jack's glare, and he shifted uncomfortably. The Emperor, however, remained focused on Jack, his mind clearly working through the implications of what he was hearing. This planet, the Emperor said slowly, if it is alive, if it is capable of controlling its environment and the creatures that inhabit it, then it holds power unlike anything we've encountered. Power that could be of great use to the Empire. Jack's expression darkened, and he shook his head. You don't get it, do you? You can't control Drakenar. You can't conquer it. The planet doesn't want you here, and it'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't survive. The Emperor's lips curled into a thin smile. We shall see. The night on Drakenar was unlike anything the Empire had encountered before. The sky, if it could be called that, was filled with roiling clouds of black and crimson, illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning that seemed to crack the very air. The ground itself rumbled beneath their feet, a low, ominous vibration that never ceased. It was as though the planet was constantly shifting, restless and unpredictable. The Emperor's camp was heavily fortified, with energy shields raised to protect them from the violent storms and whatever creatures lurked in the shadows. Elite soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Despite the overwhelming sense of danger, the Emperor remained calm, confident in the Empire's technology and the strength of his forces. Jack, however, sat apart from the group, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. He had warned them, told them everything he knew, but he could see the arrogance in their eyes. They thought they could tame Drakenar, bend it to their will. They had no idea what they were up against. Human, the Emperor's voice called out, breaking Jack from his thoughts. He turned to see the Emperor approaching, his regal armor gleaming even in the dim light of Drakenar's twisted sky. You speak of Drakenar as though it is a living thing, but I see only a planet, a hostile one, yes, but still just a planet. Jack rose to his feet, facing the Emperor. It's more than that. You'll see soon enough. The Emperor regarded Jack for a long moment, his gaze cold and calculating. Tomorrow, we will begin our exploration of this planet. I want to know everything, its secrets, its weaknesses, its strengths, and you will guide us. Jack shook his head. I told you, there's no conquering Drakenar. The Emperor's expression hardened. That is not for you to decide. You will lead us, or you will be left here to die. Jack's eyes narrowed, and he felt a surge of anger rise within him. If you push this planet, it'll push back. Hard. The Emperor turned, his cape billowing behind him as he strode away. We shall see. As the night wore on, the soldiers grew restless. The constant rumbling of the ground, the strange noises carried on the wind, it was unnerving, even for the most hardened warriors. Jack sat near the fire, his eyes flicking between the shadows that danced just beyond the camp's perimeter. He could feel it, the planet watching them, waiting. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the air, followed by a series of clicks and hisses that sent a chill down Jack's spine. The soldiers immediately raised their weapons, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. And then, without warning, the ground beneath the camp erupted. A massive creature, its body a twisted amalgamation of stone and flesh, burst forth from the earth, its jaws wide and snapping at the nearest soldier. The creature was unlike anything the Empire had ever seen, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It moved with terrifying speed, its limbs covered in jagged, obsidian-like spikes. Panic erupted in the camp as soldiers opened fire, their weapons barely making a dent in the creature's thick, stone-like hide. Jack scrambled to his feet, grabbing his makeshift spear as the creature tore through the camp, sending soldiers flying in every direction. The Emperor stood at the center of the chaos, his face a mask of fury as he barked orders to his men. But even as they fought, Jack could see the truth in the Emperor's eyes. Drakenar had awakened. Chapter 3. The planet fights back. The camp was engulfed in chaos. The creature had emerged from the earth with a terrifying ferocity, its massive body heaving out of the ground as if Drakenar itself had birthed it from the depths. The beast's limbs were coated in jagged, obsidian-like rock, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Every movement it made sent shockwaves through the ground, creating a rippling earthquake that knocked even the Empire's elite soldiers off their feet. For a few moments, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, the entire camp exploded into action as soldiers raised their weapons and opened fire, sending waves of energy blasts and plasma rounds at the monstrous entity. Yet, the creature's thick, rock-like hide absorbed the brunt of the attack, with sparks and small shards of debris flying off its body, barely leaving a scratch. Jack Rains stood frozen for a brief second, his mind racing. He'd seen Drakenar's creatures before, seen men torn apart by their claws and teeth, but this was something else. Something far worse. Keep moving. Don't let it pin you down, Jack shouted, grabbing one of the nearby soldiers and pushing him out of the path of the beast's rampaging limbs. The soldiers were trained for war, the best of the Galactic Empire's forces, but nothing in their training had prepared them for this. The creature's sheer size made it nearly impossible to avoid, and with each swing of its massive, spiked arms, the ground itself trembled. The beast was an extension of Drakenar, a living weapon forged by the planet's hostile environment, and it fought as if it had a singular purpose: to destroy every intruder in its path. The Emperor, standing near the center of the camp, barked commands with a calm fury. Focus fire on its joints. Bring it down at the legs. His voice cut through the panic, and his soldiers obeyed, regrouping and targeting the creature's weaker spots. But even as they concentrated their attacks, the beast pressed forward, relentless. Jack grabbed his makeshift spear, knowing full well that it would do little against a creature of this size. Still, he couldn't stand idle. He had warned the Emperor and his men that Drakenar wasn't a planet that could be conquered. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and this creature was proof of that. He darted through the chaos, narrowly avoiding the stampede of panicked soldiers, his eyes scanning for a weak spot in the creature's defenses. The beast was tearing through the camp, reducing everything in its path to rubble. Tents, equipment, and fortified barriers were swept aside as if they were nothing. In its wake, soldiers lay motionless, some groaning in pain, others already dead. The beast let out a roaring, earth-shattering, guttural sound that reverberated through the entire landscape. Jack had heard it before, the sound of Drakenar's creatures signaling to one another. This was no ordinary animal. It was calling for reinforcements. More would come. Fall back. Jack shouted to the soldiers nearest him. Get out of the open. It's going to bring more of them. One of the soldiers glanced at him, wide-eyed with fear. More? You've got to be kidding me. But Jack knew better. He had survived Drakenar long enough to understand that when one of these creatures appeared, others were never far behind. It was as if the planet itself was coordinating their attacks, testing the invaders to see how they would react. And it had just started. The Emperor's personal guard rallied to his side, forming a defensive line as they continued their barrage of firepower. Plasma cannons and energy rifles poured their fury into the beast, but the creature seemed unfazed, as though it was drawing strength from the very ground beneath it. Every time it moved, the earth shifted, almost as if it was controlling the terrain itself. Boulders rolled into position, providing it with natural cover, and the storm above intensified, thickening the air with toxic clouds and blinding rain. Jack skidded to a stop near the Emperor's position. You need to pull your men back. This isn't a fight you can win. The Emperor turned to Jack, his face twisted into a sneer. A coward's words. We are the Empire, we do not retreat. Jack gritted his teeth. This isn't about retreating. It's about survival. If you keep pushing, this planet will kill you all. The Emperor's eyes flashed with cold fury. We will bring this beast to its knees, and we will bend Drakenar to our will. As if in response to the Emperor's defiance, the creature let out another thunderous roar. It slammed one of its massive limbs into the ground, sending a shockwave rippling through the earth. The ground beneath the camp began to crack and shift, large fissures opening up, swallowing men and equipment alike. Several soldiers screamed as they were dragged into the abyss, their bodies disappearing into the darkness below. Jack felt the ground beneath him tremble violently, and he dove for cover just as a massive chunk of rock exploded upward, nearly crushing him. The planet was fighting back, and it was getting worse by the second. I told you, Jack shouted over the cacophony. Drakenar is not just some planet you can conquer. It's alive. The Emperor's expression shifted, but only for a moment. His eyes narrowed as he raised his arm, signaling his troops. Focus all firepower on its head. Bring it down. The soldiers obeyed, concentrating their fire on the creature's head. Plasma rounds and energy blasts slammed into the beast's skull, but still, it pushed forward, unrelenting. The ground around it continued to shift, the planet itself working in tandem with the creature, making it nearly impossible for the soldiers to gain any ground. And then, with a deafening crack, the earth split wide open beneath the beast. A massive chasm yawned before it, and for a moment, the creature faltered, its balance disrupted by the sudden change in terrain. It let out a pained howl as it stumbled, its massive limbs thrashing as it tried to regain its footing. Jack saw his chance. Now, hit it while it's down. The soldiers unleashed a final barrage of firepower, and this time, their aim was true. The concentrated blast struck the creature's exposed joints, sending shards of rock and flesh flying. The beast let out one final, agonized roar before it collapsed into the chasm, its body disappearing into the darkness below. For a moment, there was silence. The storm above continued to rage, but the ground was still. The soldiers stared in disbelief at the empty space where the creature had fallen, their weapons still raised, unsure if the battle was truly over. The Emperor stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the chasm. He had won, but his expression was far from triumphant. There was something unsettling about the way the planet had fought back, as though this was only the beginning. Jack stood beside him, his chest heaving with exhaustion. You might have killed that one, he said, his voice low and grim. But there's more where that came from, and Drakenar's not done with us yet. The Emperor didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the chasm, the shadows below shifting in the dim light. Somewhere, deep within the planet, something stirred. Hours later, as the camp was being rebuilt and the wounded were tended to, Jack sat alone at the edge of the cliffs, staring out into the distance. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with an unseen energy that prickled at his skin. He knew the Emperor wouldn't give up. He knew they would keep pushing, keep trying to conquer Drakenar. And that was exactly what the planet wanted. The storm clouds above roiled and twisted, and in the distance, Jack could see something moving, shapes, too far away to make out clearly, but unmistakably alive. More of Drakenar's creatures, lurking just beyond the horizon. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. The planet was watching, waiting for the next move. And it wouldn't be long before it struck again. Chapter 4. The Planet Awakens. The night was long and filled with unease. Jack Rains lay on the cold, hard ground, his mind racing with everything he had seen. The ground beneath him felt alive, like it was pulsing faintly, vibrating with some primal energy. Every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers, and every rumble in the earth reminded him that they were not welcome here. He had warned the Emperor and his soldiers, but pride had blinded them. They believed they could bend this world to their will, but Jack knew better. Drakenar wasn't a planet that could be conquered. It was a force of nature, ancient and aware. Jack didn't sleep much that night, and when the pale light of Drakenar's dawn began to break through the thick, swirling clouds, he rose from his makeshift shelter and surveyed the camp. The soldiers were on edge, their eyes scanning the horizon, weapons held tight. They had fought a monstrous creature the day before, something none of them had ever seen, and they had barely survived. Many of the men carried fresh scars, physical and mental, but the Emperor had already given the order to press on. The camp was eerily quiet as the Emperor's voice rang out. His regal figure stood atop a small rise, overlooking his gathered troops. His cape fluttered in the toxic winds, and his face was as stern and cold as ever. Today, we venture deeper into Drakenar, the Emperor announced. Yesterday's beast was but a taste of what this planet holds, and we will not be deterred. This world's secrets will belong to the Empire. Jack stood off to the side, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He had tried to warn them that Drakenar wasn't like any other world. It wasn't just the creatures or the storms. The planet itself seemed to react to intruders, as though it were sentient. And yet, the Emperor had refused to listen. He couldn't afford to. His empire was built on conquest, on power, and Drakenar held the promise of something beyond his wildest dreams. But it also held dangers that no amount of firepower or strategy could defeat. The soldiers began to mobilize, breaking off into scouting parties to explore different regions of the planet. The Emperor's plan was simple. Send groups in multiple directions to cover more ground and gather as much data as possible. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of dread as he watched them go. They were walking into a trap they didn't even realize had been set. As the troops moved out, Jack approached the Emperor, who was standing with General Catter and a few high-ranking officers, discussing their strategy. "You're making a mistake," Jack said, his voice rough and tired. The Emperor turned to him, his cold eyes narrowing. "You've said that before, human, yet we still stand. We defeated the creature that attacked us, and we will defeat whatever else this planet throws at us." Jack shook his head. "That creature wasn't acting on its own. Drakenar sent it after you. And now, you're going deeper into its territory. You don't understand what you're dealing with." The Emperor's face twisted in annoyance. "I understand perfectly. This is a planet, like any other. It may be hostile, but it can be tamed. And I will tame it." Jack stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only the Emperor could hear. "This isn't just a planet. It's alive. It knows we're here, and it's watching us. The more you push, the more it'll push back. You won't survive." The Emperor's gaze hardened. "Enough of your superstitions, human. You may have survived here by running and hiding, but that is not the way of the Empire. We face our enemies head-on, and we conquer them." Jack clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. Drakenar isn't an enemy you can fight with guns and soldiers. It's smarter than that. It's waiting for you to make the wrong move. The Emperor turned away dismissively. "We shall see." The day wore on as the soldiers fanned out across the planet's unforgiving landscape. Each squad was equipped with advanced scanning technology, mapping the terrain and searching for any signs of ancient relics or resources that might explain Drakenar's unusual hostility. The Emperor remained at the central camp, surrounded by his elite guards, overseeing the operation with cold precision. Jack stayed back, watching the events unfold with growing unease. He could feel it, the way the ground seemed to shift subtly underfoot, the way the air grew heavier with each passing hour. Drakenar was responding to their presence. It was waiting, preparing for something. By midday, reports began to trickle in from the scouts. Several teams had encountered strange, unnatural formation spires of black stone that jutted from the ground like jagged teeth. Others had stumbled upon ancient ruins, half buried in the shifting earth. But there was no sign of any sentient life, no indication of who or what had once lived here. It was as if the planet itself had erased its past. And then, just as the Emperor was preparing to send reinforcements to one of the scouting teams, a panic transmission came through the comms. Under attack. Repeat, we're under attack. Something huge dash. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. The Emperor's expression darkened. Where did that transmission come from? One of the technicians frantically tapped at his console. Sector 7, Your Excellency. About 12 kilometers to the west. The Emperor's lips thinned. Send reinforcements immediately. I want that team recovered. Jack stepped forward, his voice tense. It's happening again. Drakenar's sending more of those creatures. The Emperor shot him a glare. Then we'll kill them. Jack shook his head. You're not getting it. It's not just the creatures. The planet is changing. It's using everything it has to drive you off. The Emperor ignored him, turning to General Catter. Take a unit and retrieve that team. If they're under attack, eliminate the threat. Catter saluted and began to rally his troops, but Jack grabbed his arm, desperation in his eyes. Listen to me. You're walking into a trap. Drakenar doesn't want you here. You need to pull back, regroup, and get off this planet while you still can. Catter hesitated, glancing at the Emperor, but the ruler's icy gaze left no room for doubt. Go, General. With a nod, Catter led his men westward, their armored forms disappearing into the jagged, stormy horizon. Jack felt his stomach twist. He had seen this before, the way Drakenar played with its prey, drawing them deeper into the planet's embrace until it was too late to escape. The soldiers were walking into a death trap, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Hours passed, and the tension in the camp grew unbearable. The sky had darkened, thick clouds swirling above in a violent storm that seemed to blot out the sun. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the landscape in harsh, sporadic bursts. Jack stood at the edge of the camp, watching the horizon, waiting for the inevitable. And then, the ground began to shake. It started as a low rumble, barely perceptible, but it grew in intensity with each passing second. The ground trembled beneath their feet, sending ripples through the earth. Soldiers scrambled to their feet, eyes wide with panic as the shaking intensified. Suddenly, the comms lit up with frantic voices. General Catter's unit. They're gone. The ground. It swallowed them. The Emperor's face twisted in rage. What do you mean, gone? Another transmission crackled through. The ground opened up beneath them. They didn't stand a chance. There's something moving under the surface dash. Static cut off the rest of the transmission. The Emperor's hands clenched into fists. What is happening? Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with urgency. It's Drakenar. I told you it's fighting back. Before the Emperor could respond, the ground beneath the camp split open with a deafening roar. Massive fissures tore through the earth, swallowing tents, equipment, and men alike. The soldiers scrambled to escape, but the ground shifted beneath them, shifting in unpredictable ways. It was as if the planet itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap them. From the chasms, massive tendrils of rock and earth shot up, coiling like serpents around the camp. They moved with terrifying speed, slamming into soldiers and structures with deadly precision. Screams filled the air as men were crushed or dragged into the fissures, disappearing into the dark abyss below. The Emperor drew his weapon, his face contorted with fury. We will not be defeated by a planet. But Jack knew the truth. Drakenar wasn't just a planet. It was a living entity, and it had decided that the intruders had overstayed their welcome. He grabbed the Emperor's arm. We have to leave. Now. The Emperor wrenched his arm free, his eyes blazing with anger. I will not run. But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them began to quake once more, and Jack knew they were out of time. The planet had awakened, and it was coming for them all.